meant to visit up there maybe last April or something like that, and we had to reschedule it. So back then, my book would have still been somewhat new and cutting edge, but a year later, I thought it would be interesting to sort of share some of my latest research, which touches on some of the themes from the book. So why don't I sort of get started by sharing my screen. How's that look? Okay, got the thumbs up. Perfect. Certainly I'm happy to be interrupted as I'm going. It's pretty hard to keep your eye on the chat here, but I guess I can pull that up. In case anyone has a question, you can chat and I can try and stop and answer, or just unmute yourself and ask. I mean, it's a small enough group. I think that that could work as well. So yeah, I'm going to share a little bit about some of my research over the last few years related to this idea of how algorithmic intermediaries shape attention to news. As Valerie mentioned, you know, this is sort of coming on the back of my book from 2019, which covers a lot of different terrain related to this idea of algorithms in news media, including, you know, data mining for editorial purposes, finding stories in large data sets, automatically writing stories, looking at news bots, and how journalists use them, but also how they upset you know, media distribution and can create problems related to propaganda. And then algorithms and distribution. So, you know, talking about Facebook and Twitter and so on, and the question of investigating algorithms, not only in the media systems that we interact with, but also more broadly throughout society. So that's sort of the scope of the topics in the book. But today's talk, I'm really going to focus on these last two areas, algorithms of distribution and investigating algorithms. And I'm going to share the results from a few empirical studies where we've audited these algorithmic curators with respect to news information and with an eye out for understanding patterns and biases in sources and content and attention that people give to the content via these platforms. So news attention, still largely dominated by Facebook and Google. These stats are a couple of years old now, but you know, 45%, roughly 45% of adults get news on Facebook, 2/3 from social media in general. More than half of US adults get news from Google, and about a quarter around the world say it's their main gateway to news. And if you look at the traffic patterns as measured by Parsley, roughly 70% of external traffic to websites is coming from those two platforms. So these are really the large dominant platforms that are impacting what people see today. So I started getting interested in understanding the algorithms on these platforms back in 2013. And this slide was actually taken from a presentation at I think it was a NewsFu conference in 2013, a presentation from a data scientist working at Google at the time. And the slide presents the results of a study that was actually done in late 2012, where Facebook was interested in how the degree of news in the news feed might interact with voter turnout. And so they ran an experiment. This was, you know, roughly, although before I think the emotional contagion experiment, which got a lot of press on it. But so what they did was you can see in the two panels being shown here, and there are two tracks in each panel, there's a control condition and a boost condition. The boost condition is Facebook turning up the amount of hard news in the news feed. So they're boosting up the amount of hard news that people would see. And then the control condition is just like the normal everyday algorithm, whatever that was in 2012 when they did this study. And then they matched the people who were in the study to a post-election survey to ask them about their voting behavior. And they also, I want to say they also matched this to voting rules to actually look at voting behavior. And so what you can see here in the top panel is that the boosted condition actually increases the mean turnout, which is the variable that you're seeing on the x-axis. And the degree of the boost is really a function of whether or not people are logging in every day or less frequently than every day. So the top panel is less frequently than every day. You see a larger boost, and the bottom panel is logging in every day. So, so this was really striking to me. This got me really interested in this question of the power of these platforms in democracy and how they could impact democracy just in terms of like the amount of news that they're showing people in their news feeds. And of course, this is, still relevant today with the news around Facebook, pulling out of Australia and then, bringing news back to Australia. So, these are still relevant, timely issues that we're dealing with. But certainly, I think underscores the power of platforms and how they're distributing news. Of course, these types of algorithms are everywhere now. They're not only in media systems, but they're used throughout society, criminal justice, welfare management, teacher rankings, and on and on and on. And this relates to another idea that I talk about in the book, and which is sort of core to the studies I want to present to you today, which is this idea of algorithmic accountability. And this really gets at this idea of, how do we investigate and explain these algorithms and these algorithmic decisions that are being used throughout society? Again, not only in news media, but in many different sectors in government and in private organizations. And how can researchers and journalists and other stakeholders sort of characterize the biases, the way that power is exerted, or the way that influence is exerted by these algorithms? And I should mention here that I don't think of algorithmic accountability as something that's just about the technical side of algorithms. I think we really need to sort of think of algorithms as composite socio-technical systems. It's the technology plus all of the designers, operators, owners, maintainers, and so on. And algorithmic accountability is really about understanding how people exercise power both within and through the technical apparatus of the system. And of course, I think I will always argue that there needs to be a person who's held responsible when these systems go awry or when they create impacts that perhaps we're not all happy with. So this largely motivates the research that I'm going to show to you in a moment. So let's kind of dive in on Google here. So, as I mentioned before, Google is a really important platform and entry point for news consumption in the public. And I started getting really interested in Google search in 2015 when I read this paper in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences around the search engine manipulation effect, SEME. And what they found in this paper is they actually ran a series of experiments, and they had different conditions in the experiments. What they did was they created a mock search engine. So they weren't using Google or Bing or anything like that. They created their own search engine, and then they manipulated the stance of the information and where that was in the ranking of information with respect to two different candidates in an election. I believe this is from the 2010 election in Australia. So in condition A, you can see on the first page of results, it was all very pro one candidate. And then as you move down the pages, it became pro the other candidate. And condition B, they flipped those. And what they found in this study was that that you could actually shift the voting intentions of almost a quarter of undecided voters just by biasing the rankings this way, just by the sort of ranking bias of showing more supportive information at the top of the ranking. And this was in comparison to the control condition, which is condition C, where they interleave the candidates in terms of pro information or supporting information. Now, in the initial study, there were also a number of participants who recognized that the search engine was biased. And so in conditions D and E, the researchers put basically a distractor item on the first page of results. And the impact in terms of voting intention was the same, but people were far less likely to recognize that there was bias in the rankings. So this got me very interested in whether or not these types of biases, these types of biases in rankings were actually observable in real search engines. Remember, that study was a lab study. It was based on essentially a fake search engine. And so I was interested in, whether or not there was sort of any ecological validity, or whether or not these types of biases actually emerged in the real world. So in late 2015, we started studying this on actual Google search results pages. We collected all of the top results on the first page of results when searching for different politicians' names. And when we started this, it was still the primaries in 2015. So a world before Trump was really anything more than just a primary contender. And so we collected data on all of these candidates, and this is sort of how this turned out. Now, for each of the, I should mention, for each of the results that we collected, we measured a favorability score, basically the degree to which the result was supporting or opposing the candidate. And here's what those results look like. So on the x-axis, you have result rank, and on the y-axis, you have that favorability score, which is like how much the result is actually supporting the candidate. And you can see a couple patterns here. One is that the blue line is above the red line. So results in general were more favorable toward Democratic candidates than towards Republican candidates. This is searching for the candidate's name. And you also see this pattern of like, it generally tends to be more favorable at the top of the page than the bottom of the page. And certainly when you drill into the results, you can see that it's at the bottom of the page where you start to see critical news sites that are sort of criticizing the candidate, whereas at the top of the ranking, it's sort of like candidate controlled sites, like their homepage or their Senate page, or campaign pages or social media pages. If we break this out, you can see the individual results for the different Republican and Democratic candidates that we tracked. I guess you see a lot more orange in the top block of Republican candidates, indicating that there were a lot more results that were opposing the candidate in those rankings. We started also to get interested in how candidates were represented visually on search pages. And I will draw your attention to this chapter, which is at the bottom of that slide there, where we actually present some initial results of an analysis there. But we were also interested in this in the news box, which was sort of the part of Google search that was very specifically focused in on news sources. And they've actually rebranded it now. So this is a screenshot from 2015, but now it's called Top Stories. And we were interested in drilling in on that and sort of understanding what sources were showing up there in the news section. So we had a couple of research questions here. The first was, do these top stories actually provide a diverse set of sources? What about the ideological perspectives of the sources that are presented there to users as they're searching? But then also more generally, how how do these Google top stories actually influence attention to that news information? And that second research question, I'm actually going to show you some results where we quantify the amount of attention that positioning in the news section draws to news sites. So what do we do? We wanted to also focus our study on hard news, and so we wanted to come up with a set of queries that we could query Google on that were related to hard news events, and then look at the in the news results for those hard news events. So in order to get a query sample, we looked at Google Trends. We visited that every day in the morning for a month in 2017, and then we applied a definition of hard news to those trending stories to select query terms that we were going to then plug in to Google in order to harvest the results for those Google queries. Sorry, moving quickly here. In terms of our data collection, we then plugged in these queries and scraped them for 24 hours each, every minute. So every minute of every hour for 24 hours, we would collect all of the links and information from the top stories box. We also included organic links, including like the source and when the story was published, and so on. And we ended up with about 6,300 articles that we collected this way. And here's sort of what the distribution of sources looks like once we tabulate all of those articles that we collected. You can see a couple patterns here. One, you've got CNN at the top. You've got CNN, the New York Times, and Washington Post dominating roughly 20-ish% of the sources that appeared in the top stories box. I can also say that in these top 20, that accounted for about 52% of the impressions to news articles went to these top 20 sources. And so, there's a fair bit of concentration of attention to mainstream media that shows up in Google. And it's worth sharing here, I think, also that we found a fair bit of variation by query. So if you looked at different queries in our data set, you might see a very different distribution of which sources were getting the most attention for that query. We also looked at the ideological diversity of the sources that we found. To do this, we borrowed ratings of the 500 most shared news organizations on Facebook. This was from another study published in 2015. These ratings key in on users' preference for sharing a source. So Facebook basically looked at people's stated political affiliation, and they looked at how often sources were shared by people with particular affiliations to sort of arrive at a rating from -1 to 1, with -1 being more left-leaning and +1 being more right-leaning. So important to keep in mind this definition of media bias when you're reading our results, which I'll show you here. So this is what we found in terms of the ideological distribution. The vast majority of impressions to articles that we saw in top stories were from left-leaning, or I should say, sources whose audiences tend to be left-leaning, and then far fewer on the right. There was a good chunk, about a quarter, where we weren't able to label the sources, so we don't have information on those. But even if the 26.3% where we don't have ratings data were somehow all right-leaning, which it's not, but let's just say for the sake of argument, it was all right-leaning, we would still see a skew towards news on the left. Now, we might be wondering what's really going on here. Maybe Google's algorithm is biased, maybe it's selecting left-leaning sources, but maybe there's just more news content being produced on the left. This is a highly viable hypothesis given what's been published about media bias. And perhaps Google is just reflecting this greater availability of news on the left. So we wanted to test this alternate hypothesis, and what we did was we went out and we gathered a few 100,000 articles from a corpus called GDELT, G-D-E-L-T, and we used the same queries that we used to collect data from Google, but this time we plugged them into the GDELT index, which indexes hundreds of thousands of news sites, and looked at what was the prevalence of left versus right-leaning sources in the GDELT corpus. So if we just sort of look in the result column here, all the way to the right, in GDELT, there was about 2.2 times as many left versus right-leaning sources that we observed for these queries. And for Google, for the Google articles that we measured in the top stories box, there was 3.2 times as many left versus right-leaning. So there is a background skew towards left-leaning content out there. It seems like in our data that Google was pushing it even to be a little bit more concentrated toward the left. Not to say that I think there's any conspiracy going on here. I just think that this is a result of algorithmic processes that maybe tend to favor left-leaning outlets in terms of popularity. There may also be sort of correlations based on the queries that we were choosing, because remember, we're using Google Trends to select these queries. And of course, there could be a bias towards more popular, potentially more left-leaning queries if there tend to be more queries being issued by left-leaning people. In other words, what's driving the trend is then perhaps trickling through to what we observe in terms of the end result here. So who cares? What does this all add up to? Well, let me try to show you what this means in terms of how this shapes actual attention. So to look at this next question, we actually teamed up with Chartbeat, which, as many of you probably know, collects a lot of analytics data and measures referrals or click-throughs from on the internet to various news organizations. And so, the referral data that Chartbeat shared with us basically can measure whether or not someone on a Google page like google.com clicked on a news source on an article that is being tracked by Chartbeat. But what Chartbeat can't tell you is whether or not that article was in the top stories box versus further down on the page, like in the organic results. So this is where it becomes important that we also collected those organic results, because we can try and control for that. So we did some statistical modeling here. We actually ended up building 2 models, and we looked at top stories impressions, so an appearance of an article in the top stories box, and we also looked at the organic impressions down on the rest of the page as predictors of referrals to the article from Google via the Chartbeat data that we have. So we're basically looking at like how many click-throughs do you get if you have something in top stories. We modeled this as a negative binomial regression with over-dispersed count data, which fit the characteristics of our data. And we included a dummy variable to group on query term, because attention varies quite widely between queries. So we did that to control for it. And here's the model results, and I'll just parse this for you quickly. Again, I mentioned that there were 2 models. The first model just looks at organic impressions versus top stories impressions. The second model actually breaks down the position of the article within the top stories box. So rank 1 would be the leftmost, rank 2 would be middle, and rank 3 would be the rightmost position in the top stories box. But let me just talk about model 1 here for a second. You can see, based on the beta coefficient, which is 0.0017, you can see that basically, to interpret this model, 1 additional impression on the top stories position is associated with 0.17% more referrals to that article. Now, one thing to note here is that in our data, one impression is measured every minute. So an article receiving 60 impressions in an hour in the top stories box would be expected to receive about 10 to 11% more referral traffic from Google. The organic impressions were a little bit less, but not that much less. So organic impressions are also driving a good amount of traffic. In the second model, where we break it out by position, you can see that actually the middle position has the highest beta coefficient in terms of driving the most traffic, which was a little surprising. I thought it would be the leftmost position, but the data indicated it was the middle position. I see that there's a question in the chat. Sorry. To what extent do the definitions of left and right leaning align with the public's perceptions of those sources? They align very well. So the data that we used was compared with a couple of different ways of measuring media bias or media slant, and they found very high correlations between their ratings and ratings measured in different ways. Another question, data collection question. How did you make sure Google wasn't showing top stories based on location, past web history, or top stories not aggregated that way? Great question. I would refer you to the details in the paper where we try and control for all that stuff. And I know I'm like blasting through all of the methodological details just to try to get to the results to show you kind of the top line of what's going on. But there is a lot of like care and attention that we gave to trying to collect clean data and, using, making sure we weren't logged in and, using fresh browser profiles with no cookies and stuff like that. I also want to talk a little bit about a more recent project where we're looking at Apple News. So another intermediary where we've been curious about how Apple is shaping attention to news information. So let me dive into that as well. So Apple News has something like 90 million plus users now. So many of you probably are familiar with this, but for anyone who doesn't use Apple or was maybe on Android, this is what it looks like. You have a top story section when you first open the app. And this top story section is all manually selected stories by editors, many of whom come from journalism backgrounds and are hired by Apple. And so there's sort of a lot of curation and manual curation given to the top story section. If you scroll down the app a little bit, you get to the trending story section. And the trending story section is algorithmically generated. And it does not have a manual curation component. So we got interested in comparing these two sections, like what kinds of sources show up in top stories versus trending stories. So here are our research questions there. We had a couple questions about the mechanism because we actually weren't sure about whether or not Apple News was doing things like personalization or localization or how often it was even updating things. So we had a couple of research questions around the mechanism of the algorithm and how it was updating things. And then we had some content questions related to, what's the concentration and distribution of sources here? What types of topics are shown most often? So we wanted to actually start drilling into the content, which is something we hadn't done looking at Google, to understand what's the nature of content that is being surfaced in these different, via these different curation strategies. Now for the audit approach here, we had some challenges here. Apple doesn't have a public API, so you can't just go out and collect data on an API. And they use a security technique known as SSL pinning, which means that you can't even scrape their app because there's just no way to get to an internal API endpoint. So what we ended up doing is we actually simulated the app in an app QA environment. So it's called Appium. And you load up Appium, and Appium will simulate an iPhone for you, and then you can load Apple News on that simulated iPhone. The way we did it was we actually got an app, it's called Mac in Cloud. So it's like Amazon Web Services, but you actually have like a Mac operating system connected to the internet, and you can just connect to it and launch this Appium and then simulate Apple News. So, so we used Appium to simulate and collect data from the app. But we also used a crowdsourcing method, Mechanical Turk, in order to answer our questions related to personalization. So we wanted to know whether or not people in different locations were seeing different stories when they looked at Apple News. Here's the sort of top line results that we saw. Again, comparing these trending stories versus top stories, we found that there was no localization going on. We found no evidence of anything other than just one national view of either section. After this paper came out, actually Apple News contacted me and they're like, hey, could we chat? And they actually confirmed that that there was no localization or personalization going on. So I felt pretty good that our method had sort of pinpointed that and we were able to determine that. Something else I want to point out is that in the trending story section, there were about 3,100 unique stories. And this was data collected for a period of 2 months in 2019, every 20 minutes. So we found about 3,100 stories in the trending story sections, only about 1,300 in the top stories. So you can see there's a disparity in the volume of content that's being sort of pumped through those different sections. There's much lower churn in the top story section. We found roughly the same number of unique sources between the two sections, 83 in trending, 87 in top. Those weren't perfect overlaps. They only overlap about 40 to 45 of the sources overlap. So there's also like another 40 sources that are sort of unique to each section. But again, sort of with this general theme of like, there's a lot of attention concentrated on a relatively small number of sources here. In trending stories, the top 10 sources accounted for 75% of the stories there. And in the top stories, it was about 56% for the top 10 sources. So again, a lot of attention to relatively small number of sources. Keep in mind, I'm not making a filter bubble argument here. I'm just saying that, we sort of, it's interesting to see how much these platforms really kind of drive attention to a fairly small number of sources. Here's a little bit more detail on that. You can see on the upper left, sources for top stories dominated by Washington Post, CNN, NBC, New York Times. Whereas sources for trending stories in the lower right, you still have CNN up there, but you also have Fox News, People, BuzzFeed, Huffington Post. You do have Washington Post, but you have Vanity Fair, Newsweek, E-Online. So you start to get a feel that the trending stories maybe are coming from some magazines, some softer sources, maybe some more entertainment-related information. And whereas the top stories, that manually selected sources, tend to come from pretty straight news organizations. Now, one thing I also wanted to mention here is that for the top story section, we found that they sometimes pulled stories from regional outlets like LA Times, Chicago Tribune, or Miami Herald. But that only accounted for about 8% of the articles that were featured there. And in the trending stories, we found absolutely no evidence of local or regional news stories. So zero. I thought that was kind of striking that trending really was a nationally trending stuff and from national outlets. Valerie asked some questions. To what extent is that influenced by the type of partnerships these news outlets have? Yeah, great question. We didn't analyze this data through the lens of whether or not the publisher has a partnership. But it's an important question because actually, in order to even be on Apple News, I think it's the the top story section, you have to put your content in Apple News format, which is like a particular format that needs to be translated into in order to be featured on the app. And not that you necessarily have to be a partner to have your content in that format, but it is an additional barrier to a publisher to, let's say, have a tech team who can like translate the content, or a CMS that can translate the content in the right way into the Apple News format. Matt Carlson asked, do you know if some of these are AP stories or are they all staff written? That's a good question. We didn't look at the bylines of the stories that we found there. I think anecdotally, just from having looked through the data myself, I want to say that I wasn't seeing AP stories that were coming through here via the wire. I think they were mostly staff written, but I would have to double check the data. Here's another view on the comparison. So on the left, the proportion in the top stories, and then on the right, the proportion in the trending stories. So you can see the contrast here. Fox News really only showed up, or showed up much more prominently in the trending stories than in the top stories. People, CNN shows up in both. BuzzFeed is mostly on trending. Washington Post shows up on both, but is much more on the top stories, and on down the line. I mentioned this before, but another thing we looked at was the content of the articles based on the headlines that we looked at. And what we found when we analyzed that was actually that the trending section tended to refer to celebrities. Donald Trump was getting mentioned a lot. There were some shocking and sensational stories. Florida Man appeared in 11 of the headlines that we collected over the 2-month span. So if anyone's not familiar with that meme, please check Wikipedia for the Florida Man meme. But that gives you a feel for the type of content that their trending algorithm is surfacing, right? In contrast, when we looked at the headlines and the top stories content, these reflected more substantive political issues. Topics like health came up, the Affordable Care Act, immigration. We were talking about border walls and sanctuary cities at the time, and international politics and events as well. So you definitely see that contrast in here's what the manual curation gets you in terms of content, and here's what the trending algorithm gets you in terms of content. So I want to try and blaze through one last study here because this one is actually the most recent, where we started getting interested in news on Amazon Alexa. And a lot of people have these home speakers now, these smart speakers. Based on some surveys that NPR has done, it's about 1 in 4 Americans have them now. Amazon has most of the market there. About 2/3 of the market is with Amazon. And also based on these surveys, about 3 in 4 people rely on smart speakers to answer general questions, informational questions. And about 42% said that they often seek news information through these devices. So even though most traffic to news is still certainly driven through Google and Facebook and, to a much lesser extent, Apple and Twitter, these other channels, these smart speakers, are sort of a growing and sort of, I think, increasingly interesting and important platform that people are getting information and news through. So the other interesting thing about the interaction modality here is, instead of sort of browsing through news stories or searching for news stories, you really just get like one shot at the result on these devices. There's not typically like a browsing option. So the algorithm sort of has like one chance to get you information that's relevant to your query. So in our audit of Alexa, we wanted to try and have some degree of ecological validity. And so we ran a survey, crowdsource different query phrasings on Mechanical Turk. And we used those query phrasings, we kind of crunched those down using some NLP, natural language processing, into different query phrasings that were most common. So like, what happened, what is going on, can you tell me about, and what is new, with different prepositions depending on what the actual object of the query is. And what we did was, for this audit, we looked at the top 20 trending topics from Google again, and we substituted those queries into each of these different phrasings. You know, if Joe Biden is trending today, we would audit what happened to Joe Biden, what is going on with Joe Biden, and so on. And so in late 2019, we ran this audit for a couple of weeks. We tested about 1,100 queries and collected responses. And I should mention, it's kind of funny, like we had this set up as like an Amazon Alexa device talking to a computer system. So the computer system would generate the query based on the Google topic, and then do a text to speech. So you had a computer kind of generating a spoken query, and then the device would hear that spoken query from a speaker and respond, and then the computer would record the response and then also transcribe the response. So we had sort of this full digital cycle where we had the computer asking the Alexa, and then the Alexa responding, and the computer recording that response. This was sort of our analytic framework for analyzing the responses. So we looked at whether or not there was a response. Sometimes Alexa doesn't actually respond or acknowledge your response. We looked at whether or not Alexa understood the query. And to get at that, we look at if we just transcribe the query phrase directly using the Amazon API, do we get a clean transcript back? And then we looked at the relevance of the response, whether or not we thought it satisfied the user's presumed information needs. We looked at the accuracy of the response. These were all manually, relevance, accuracy, and timeliness were all manually assessed. So we have these definitions of these criteria, and then we applied these criteria to the responses that we recorded from the device. So we looked at accuracy, timeliness, whether or not it was sort of up to date to the current point in time. And this is what we found in aggregate. So about a 92% response rate, so pretty good. 76% of those responses were understood, meaning that Alexa was able to correctly transcribe the query, meaning essentially that the device was able to like turn the query into text that it could then use to generate a response. 72% of the understood responses were relevant, so decent relevance there. 16% were irrelevant, and 12% were no information, where Alexa would respond and say, you know, I don't know, basically, I don't have any information on that. So mostly relevant. And then of the relevant responses, like the vast majority were accurate, and also a very strong majority were timely as well. So there's not really a lot of like misinformation going on in Alexa. There are a few things that we found that were inaccurate, most likely from like Wikipedia pages that maybe had information that wasn't accurate, or that just the information wasn't timely. So because these are news events, like maybe there's some new information that just came out, and maybe the Alexa device is pulling on Wikipedia for this information and it hasn't been updated yet. So that's where some of these quality issues are coming in. But the vast majority were relevant, provided that the device could actually understand what you're asking. I'll just spend like 2 more minutes showing how the results break down by the query phrasing. I think because this is kind of interesting. So again, we tested 4 different query phrasings, and I'm showing you relevant, no information, or irrelevant responses in this chart. So the can you tell me about and the what happened had the highest dark blue line, the highest number of relevant responses. And then for the what is new and what is going on query phrasings, we have still okay, but not as good relevance with those phrasings. So this is kind of interesting because it gets at like how different people might encounter different information relevance just based on how they phrase their query. And you know, there's not a lot of research out there on like socio-demographic differences in terms of query phrasing with these devices, but I think it's sort of an interesting area for future work potentially to look at like, are there particular groups of people who may tend to phrase queries in particular ways that end up with those groups being less well served by these devices because of the way that they phrase these queries. Here's the information source by query phrasing broken out. You can see some phrasings also draw more on Wikipedia. So can you tell me about pulls in from Wikipedia very frequently, whereas other phrasings don't pull on Wikipedia as often. The dark blue is news sources here. So very small number of responses actually draw on and cite news sources. In fact, only 1.4% of the responses mentioned a news source as the source of information for the response. That was Reuters for 1.2% and Washington Post for 0.2%. So there's almost no news information that's sourced from an actual news organization in response to these queries, which I think is a huge opportunity for Amazon to work more effectively with news information and provide news information for news consumers. So I don't have time to go into this, but I also wasn't planning on it. But this is just a invitation to check out another paper we have where we're auditing algorithmic curation on Twitter and comparing the algorithmic curation to chronological curation on Twitter and how that impacts diversity of information exposure and concentration of attention to news sources. There's a bunch of things we could discuss, but I'm much more interested in hearing your questions than in framing my own discussion around these results. But I'm happy to leave this up. I'm also happy to share all of the references here. I'm happy to be in touch afterwards if you want to email me and follow up on any of this stuff. But really, if you go to my webpage, nickdiakopoulos.com, you should be able to get to PDFs of most of this stuff. I don't think we've posted the Alexa PDF yet, but we will shortly. So I'm going to stop there and just open it up for questions. Thanks, everyone.